Hi guys, I'm back with another video. Today's video is going to be Lost Media Category 26. Curious George, partially lost animated short TV series based on books, 1980s. Curious George is a 1980s television short series produced by Lafferty, Harwood, and Partners. Margaret Ray, co-creator of Curious George, originally began production of episodes with Alan Shellac, though LHP Latterty finished production due to financial issues. After airing in Canada, the cartoon was brought to the U.S. on Nickelodeon in the 1980s and the Disney Channel in the late 1980s through the 90s. Some episodes distributed on home media, while all were made into educational releases. A total of 104 episodes were produced, but 87 are currently found, though more are expected to be available soon, as implied by YouTuber Curious George VHS. Synopsis. The series comprised of episodes only roughly 4 to 5 minutes in length. Each story revolves around the adventure of Curious George, who lives with the man in the yellow hat, while he initially brought him home from Africa in nearly every episode. Curious George causes trouble, but recompenses for his mistakes with good deed. Releases. Lafferty, Harwood, and Partners Ltd., the company that provided the majority of the funding, illegally gave the series rights to various media distribution companies. Sony was the first company to manufacture tapes with some of the episodes. The episodes were given educational releases by several distributors, most notably among its educational releases. Luciner Films, later renamed Luciner Media, released all the episodes on several formats. One known DVD release with 12 episodes was made by New Video Group in 2004. Not to be confused with Curious George Rides a Bike DVD, made by the same company in the same year. A number of other media companies released episodes of the series throughout the 1980s and 90s. Lawsuit. In 1991, Margaret Ray, co-creator and partial right holder of Curious George, won a lawsuit against Lafferty, Harwood, and Partners LHP provide funding for 72 of the 104 episodes that were made, and as a part of the agreement were granted a TV rights to the series, extending their rights to third-party companies and distributed physical media copies of the series. LHP was charged with copyright infringement and was successfully sued for $300,000 in damages. Here are the episode list. Curious George and the Art Show, found. Curious George and the Ballot, found. Curious George Goes Sledding, found. Curious George Goes to Aquarium, found. Curious George Plays Baseball, found. Curious George Walks the Pets, found. Curious George Rides a Pony, found. Curious George to the Supermarket, found. Curious George Goes to the Ranch, found. Curious George Goes to the Library, found. Curious George Rings a Bell, found. Curious George Visits the Barber, found. Curious George at the pet shop, found. Curious George at the little dog, and the little dog, found. Curious George gets a pizza, found. Curious George goes to an ice cream shop, found. Curious George paints a billboard, found. Curious George at the bakery, found. Curious George and the new neighbors, found. Curious George and the mini marathon, found. Curious George and the runaway elephant, found. Curious George goes to the amusement park, found. Curious George at the airport, found. Curious George goes to the restaurant, found. Curious George goes fishing, found. Curious George goes to the zoo, found. Curious George goes skiing, found. Curious George goes to the bowling alley, found. Curious George at the drive-in movie, found. Curious George at the parade, found. Curious George at the photograph studio, found. Curious George plays baseball, found. Curious George goes to the department store, found. Curious George at the fire station, found. Curious George at the farm, found. Curious George at the beach, found. Curious George visits a police station, found. Curious George at the laundromat, found. Curious George delivers the papers, found. Curious George goes to the circus, found. Curious George goes to a flower show, found. Curious George visits the railway station, found. Curious George goes to the tailor shop, found. Curious George goes to college, found. Curious George wins a contest, found. Curious George goes apple picking, found. Curious George at the carnival, found. Curious George visits a ketchup factory, found. Curious George gets a star, found. Curious George visits a toy store, found. Curious George and the organ grinder, found. Curious George wins a race, found. Curious George goes to the air show, found. Curious George goes to the wedding, found. Curious George and the maple syrup, found. Curious George gets to the post office, found. Curious George visits the old town, found. Curious George and the dinosaur, found. Curious George watches the little blue car, found. Curious George goes to the gym, found. Curious George gets an x-ray, found. Curious George and the greenhouse, found. Curious George visits a hotel, found. Curious George and the dump truck, found. Curious George meets the painter, found. Curious George meets the balloon man, found. Curious George goes to tomato picking, found. Curious George goes to the museum, found. Curious George goes to the shoemaker, found. Curious George goes on the ice, found. Curious George learns to write, found. Curious George becomes a salesman, found. Curious George at the bookstore, found. Curious George visits the dentist, found. Curious George catches butterfly, found. Curious George and the puppeteer, found. Curious George plays bingo, found. Curious George catches a foul ball, found. Curious George ties a knot, found. Curious George meets an Indian, found. Curious George goes to a cook-off, found. Curious George unveils a statue, found. Curious George and the lost letter, found. Curious George plays golf, lost. Curious George goes to the television station, found. Curious George goes to a block party, lost. Curious George goes camping, lost. Curious George bakes a cake, lost. Curious George goes to a concert, lost. Curious George goes at the country store, lost. Curious George goes to a country fair, lost. Curious George builds a birdhouse, lost. Curious George types a letter, lost. Curious George and the typewriter case, lost. Curious George drives a steam shovel, lost. Curious George goes to the surprise party, lost. Curious George and the birdwatchers, lost. Curious George and the frisbee, lost. Curious George goes Christmas shopping, lost. And the last episode, Curious George on parade, lost. And that was Lost Media number 26. Curious George, partially lost animated TV series based on books. 1980s. And if you guys like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. And I'll see you guys next time. Peace, period.